Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. I'm Tristan. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Escape, the modern application security company. And we're glad to be here at API Summit 2023 to present an exclusive research named GraphQL Vulnerabilities in the Wild. And today we will explain to you what scanning real-life GraphQL apps told us about the security best practices of GraphQL production. Today, I'm here with my co-founder, Antoine, who is the CTO of Escape. So first, a little bit about Escape. Escape is the first automated security testing platform that is able to test the business logic of APIs and modern APIs like GraphQL. We have an in-house research team on API security, and we create a lot of reports. So in order to do this research, we scanned 1,600 production APIs on the internet, which costed almost 500 cumulative scan hours for getting to this result. And we found almost 50,000 security alerts on those production GraphQL endpoints. So this is a big security research that we did for GraphQL APIs. So on average, it means that there were almost 30 security alerts per GraphQL app, which is a huge amount if you consider that those GraphQL applications were production applications exposed to the internet. The result of the study in detail can be found in a report that we published on the internet. It's called the State of GraphQL Security 2023. I really encourage you to download this report if you are interested in the topic. It gives a lot of interesting figures and statistics about the security of GraphQL production apps. And now I will first let my co-founder Antoine present to you why is GraphQL especially vulnerable.
Thank you very much, Tristan. So indeed, the first thing it is important to understand here is why is GraphQL so vulnerable? So what is GraphQL first? First, GraphQL is a query language for APIs, and it is used in production by companies in every Fortune 500 verticals. That means retail, finance, travel, and so on. And it is mainly used thanks to its amazing federation capabilities that allow to combine multiple API sources in one single GraphQL endpoint. So GraphQL is an amazing language, but with great features comes great responsibilities. Every single feature here is actually also a potential source of vulnerabilities in GraphQL. In addition, GraphQL is a graph, which means that it connects a lot of different resources together, and one resource can be accessed by a huge, massive number of different paths, which makes access control extremely difficult to ensure in GraphQL. The second thing to understand here is actually how did we get this exclusive data that we are going to present you today, and why was it hard to automatically assess the security of GraphQL APIs? So this is not specific to GraphQL. Let's take the example. Let's say this. If we just set random payloads to an API, the requests won't pass the data validation layer. And therefore, those requests, they cannot really assess the business logic of an API, especially from a security standpoint. So that's why we developed a unique in-house technology that is actually able to test APIs with an unprecedented coverage. It does not require any agent, it does not require any traffic capture, and thus it does not endanger production data. So to illustrate, let's take the example of an e-commerce platform with two kinds of users. On the one hand, you have sellers that should be able to see the orders of all their customers. And on the other hand, of course, you have buyers that should not be able to see orders of all other buyers. So to test that specific business logic case, we need to set the application in a state that has at least one seller, two buyers, one product for sale, and two pending orders from two different buyers. And with our feedback-driven API exploration algorithm, so the technology we built to generate traffic on APIs, we are able to create the legitimate sequence of requests that can actually assess the situation at every update of any application from a completely automated manner. So the second thing, again, is that GraphQL is a graph. So the algorithm of security must ensure that every single path leading to all resources is actually secure because all those multiple paths should be secured. So what did we find actually? 50,000 security alerts, almost, and 10% were of critical severity. So that's why we created here our own classification that makes sense according to the GraphQL ecosystem. And here is the matching with the OWASP Top 10 23. And we can see that very interestingly, 3 main categories of vulnerabilities are emerging here. And this is what Tristan is going to present you now.
Thank you, Antoine. So as you can see, we did a full study of the security of GraphQL applications on the internet. We created our own classification of GraphQL vulnerabilities according to the vulnerabilities that we found in the wild. And here we matched it with the OWASP API top 10 vulnerabilities. And you can see that there is a precise matching between the vulnerabilities of Escape's classification and the vulnerabilities of OWASP top 10. So now, let's take a deep dive into these results. So we can observe that first, a lot of the vulnerabilities that we found during this study are specific to GraphQL. If I take a look here, I circled in blue the vulnerabilities that are specific to GraphQL, and you can see that a lot of the top ones are specific to GraphQL. It means that the GraphQL security best practices are not yet widespread among the GraphQL developers community. So a lot of production applications still are vulnerable to common vulnerabilities among GraphQL applications. So I will take a deep dive into the 3 most common GraphQL security vulnerabilities that we found during this study. The first one is the ability to brute force API requests and GraphQL API requests. So this is done by using 2 different features from GraphQL, which is batching and aliasing. So the goal of batching and aliasing is having the ability to send multiple GraphQL requests in one single HTTP request. And it can be used to actually bypass the rate limitation if the rate limitation is at the HTTP level and is not aware that what is actually inside the HTTP is GraphQL. And this is a huge problem because, for instance, if say you have a login feature in your GraphQL endpoint, this can be used to send, let's say, 100 different combination of logins and passwords in one single HTTP request, bypass the rate limit, and just brute force the user and password of some users of your application. So this can lead to account takeover, stealing the credentials of your customers, and this is a huge problem and should not be overlooked. The second vulnerability that is extremely present in GraphQL applications is denial of service. And there was one specific way to create denial of service on GraphQL is using fragments. So fragments, like a function in programming, are a piece of logic that can be shared between multiple GraphQL queries. But what happens if you create a fragment that calls itself a recursive fragment? Well, if your GraphQL engine is not protected, it enters an infinite recursion loop and just crashes, which can create a denial of service using maximum call stack size exceeded. And so this is very easy to exploit for attackers and can create denial of service and completely crash your application. So it must not be overlooked at all. And the last vulnerability that is very common in GraphQL is the internal API schema leak. So in GraphQL, you have the schema that can be exposed on the internet. For security reasons, a lot of production GraphQL endpoints try to hide their schema to avoid attackers understanding what is the data manipulated by their API. But there is a feature in GraphQL which is called the field suggestion. So basically, if you send a GraphQL request and you made a typo in a GraphQL variable name, the GraphQL engine will send you back, hey, did you mean rather this or that? And the problem is exploiting this feature can lead to building back the full schema by fuzzing random names of fields that the GraphQL engine will correct automatically. And so there is an open source tool on the internet. It's on GitHub and it's free and open source. It's named Clairvoyance. And using Clairvoyance, we are able, for instance, to build back this full GraphQL schema that you can see here, which is a real-life GraphQL schema. And it happens that in this case, there was an update admin mutation that the developers did not protect because they thought it was hidden and not available to external users. And we were able to actually change the admin password of this application without authorization. So this can lead, combined with other vulnerabilities, to huge problems and huge consequences. That is for the GraphQL specific vulnerabilities that we encountered during this study, but the classic API vulnerabilities are also still there and must not be overlooked. If we take a look at the classic API vulnerabilities that we have in this study, you can see that the HTTP server errors, so this is the first one, are also very present, and we also a lot of information disclosure, access control problems, and injections that also still exist among GraphQL APIs. So let's get a deep dive into that. The first problem that we noticed in GraphQL APIs is exposing too much information in stack traces. So when there is a GraphQL error, it gives the precise path of the source code that created the problem. And using this, you can have information about what are the libraries that are used by this GraphQL endpoint. And you can take a look on the internet on the vulnerabilities that affect those libraries. So for example, here, we can see that this endpoint uses Apollo Gateway 0.6.1, which has a vulnerability according to open source databases on the internet and can be exploited. The second problem that is very, very common in GraphQL is access control issues. So there are a lot of GraphQL endpoints that have bad access control implementation and thus let unauthorized user or user with low authorization level access restricted data. So in this case, in the case of this GraphQL endpoint, we can see that it was possible to update a payment without actually having an account or an authentication token, which is a big problem, obviously, from a security point of view. And the last problem, injections. So you can think injections are a solved problem and it has been mastered since about 2005. It's actually not the case at all. And we have found various SQL or no SQL injections, even a bash command injection and 3 server-side request forgery in GraphQL APIs that were open to the wide internet. So those can lead access to the database, can allow attackers to edit data, to steal data, and various other kinds of malicious actions. And it can be easily avoided if your developers are formed and are taught how to avoid SQL injections, and if you perform proper security testing on your GraphQL endpoints. So this is really a lack of best practices on the production GraphQL endpoints. And the last part, which is perhaps the most striking and the most alarming fact about GraphQL API in the wild, is that we found a huge amount of sensitive data that was leaking and made public through GraphQL APIs. So we will take a deep dive into the data that we found exposed on the wild by GraphQL APIs. So we found a lot of different data in those GraphQL API. We found almost 5,000 sensitive tokens, PII, and the API keys among all those GraphQL endpoints. We found first PII, so emails, phone numbers, passport numbers, bank account numbers, and so on and so forth. So a lot of sensitive data that should not be present in public API. Obviously, it should not be accessible without any authentication token, and yet it was accessible to our automated scanner on the wild without any human intervention in the process. And even more alarming, we were able to find a lot of sensitive tokens, secret, and API keys. So we found passwords, hashed passwords, not like clear passwords, clear text passwords. We found AWS tokens. We found Adobe client IDs, Asana client IDs, GCP API keys, Slack tokens, SendGrid API tokens, GitHub OAuth tokens. So a lot of those tokens were actually present in error messages for the API. So what happens is the scanner creates an error on the API, and the API sends back an error message, and the error message contains an internal token that was used to make an API call to an internal service. And this is a huge problem because those tokens often lead to privileged accounts and to give the attackers ability to execute privileged actions, which can lead to a lot of damage. So this is absolutely critical and also very alarming about the quality and security of production GraphQL endpoints. So if we do a quick recap of everything that we saw during this study, we can see that GraphQL is prone to various kind of vulnerabilities, including a lot of denial of service and complexity issues, which are due to GraphQL specific features and are linked to the API OWASP top 10 04, which is unrestricted resource consumption. So by default, the GraphQL engines accept too much queries from the user. It gives the user too much possibilities for querying the engine, and this is very vulnerable to denial of service vulnerabilities. The second problem that is very often present in GraphQL is access control, authentication, and authorization problem. So this is easily this easily appears in GraphQL because of the graph nature of GraphQL. Since GraphQL is a graph, it's very easy to forget a path in the graph that would lead to sensitive information that the developer did miss during development. So it's linked to various API top 10 categories, and it can be avoided only by implementing both best practices and proper in-depth security testing inside of the development process of GraphQL APIs to ensure that every time a developer pushes a new version of the code, there is no sensitive data leak or no access control problems that was implemented thanks to the or because of the graph nature of GraphQL. And the last kind of vulnerabilities that appear in GraphQL are a lot of security misconfiguration and information disclosure problems, which are due to federated GraphQL apps that often forget to catch error messages from underlying APIs, and also development features of the GraphQL engine that are actually enabled in production environments. So these are the main causes of GraphQL being vulnerable in production, and they are actually from three main reasons. So to conclude this presentation, we used only unauthenticated API calls, and yet we found almost 130K GraphQL APIs that were public in the wild, and we were able to scan 1,600 of them without authentication. We highlighted numerous vulnerabilities, and most frequently the vulnerabilities were GraphQL specific, but not only. We also have found injections, we also have found access control problems. So a lot of classic API flows were still present in modern GraphQL APIs. And last, access control flows and secret leaks are very frequent in GraphQL, so be sure to integrate proper automated testing that is in-depth during your development process to be sure that you do not miss any secret leaking and any access control problem. So the result of this study, again, can be found in the State of GraphQL Security 2023. It's a full-featured report that gives all the statistics and more that are present in this presentation. I really encourage you to check it out. We're quite proud of the result of this study and would love to have your feedback on it. Before we finish this presentation, two more things that are super, I believe, relevant to the community and we're super proud to release today. So the first thing is we released GraphQL Armor. GraphQL Armor is a free and open source security middleware for GraphQL applications. It can be integrated right away in your production GraphQL application, and we provide out-of-the-box security best practices for various kind of GraphQL specific vulnerability. It's a very good way to kickstart your GraphQL security process, and you can check it out right away on GitHub and on escape.tech/GraphQL Armor. It's free and open source. Feel free to contribute. Feel free to ask us on the community Discord of Escape. And we provide commercial support to GraphQL Armor users, to the customers of Escape. And before we finish, the last thing that we are releasing in exclusivity today is the Escape API Security Academy. So this is the first free and open source security learning platform dedicated to GraphQL developers. It contained a lot of all the basic courses and more advanced courses about how to secure GraphQL APIs as a developer. So we cover all of OWASP Top 10. We cover all the most common vulnerabilities of GraphQL and ever more in-depth problems like injections. It's open source and free to use on escape.tech/academy. So feel free to check it out and share it with your developers. There is also gamification integrated, so you can follow your progression in the GraphQL security field inside of the platform directly. And even more interesting, it has a full online development environment to make your developer learn by doing, which means you can execute a GraphQL server directly inside of your browser and try to test and fix the vulnerabilities directly inside of your browser. So this is very fun to use for developers, and they can quickly earn more skills in GraphQL security. We're very proud of releasing this today, so please check escape.tech/academy now. This is the end of this presentation. Thanks a lot for your attention. Again, we are Escape, and we are very glad to be here today. Feel free to check it out and come to our Discord community. This was Tristan and Antoine for Escape GraphQL Security. Thank you.